Hello, I'm Ed Moyle and welcome to this Tech Target video. Today we're talking about Netcat. This is the companion video to the article about Netcat, which I do recommend that you start with first if you haven't already seen it. The reason why is that we're going to leap into some medium to advanced examples that do presuppose that you have the fundamentals down. So if you aren't familiar with those fundamentals, I do recommend that you read the written piece first. For example, the switches that we're going to be using, we talk about what they do within the written piece. So start there if you haven't already. If you do want to follow along, there's three things that you'll need. The first one is a hypervisor. In this case, I'm using VirtualBox, but you can use Hyper-V or you can use VMware. You can really use whatever hypervisor of your choice you're most comfortable working in. The second and third things that you'll need are two virtual machines. Um, in this case, the ones I'm using are virtual machine number one, which is a vanilla Debian install. There is one change that I made to it during installation, which is I enabled the SSH server and the web server during the installation process. Those are check boxes that you can select during the installation process, and I have selected them to give us ports that we can connect to with Netcat. The other virtual machine is a stock Kali Linux install. So again, vanilla Kali Linux. A lot of the times when in a red team scenario, for example, or a pen test situation, you might be using Kali Linux. That's a very popular choice. So I wanted to make sure that one of our test boxes was Kali. So just to illustrate, you'll notice here that the IP address of the Kali box is 192.168.1.169. And the IP address of the Debian box is 192.168.1.170. Fairly easy to remember. So let's leap right in and talk about two examples today. The first one is one of the things that makes Netcat so useful, as I talked about in the article, is that by virtue of its versatility, portability, and how lightweight it is, sometimes there are cases where the only thing that you'll have you'll have access to Netcat where you might not necessarily have the ability to install a more purpose-built type tool. So for example, you might have access to Netcat, but not something like Nmap, which is more purpose-built for doing port scanning. So if you weren't aware, you can actually use Netcat as sort of a impromptu port scanner. So let's begin with that. So if you did want to do that, um, we'll in this case, we will use our Kali box Netcat on our Kali box as a port scanner to see what's running or to test to see if certain ports are running on the Debian instance. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to use here NC, which is Netcat, and then I'm going to specify a couple of different switches here. I'm going to use V, in this case VV. So V or VV is for verbose output. Um, Depends on which particular flavor of Netcat you're using, but VV tends to be extra verbose, whereas V is just verbose output. I'm going to specify also the N switch. What that means is that it's not going to do any DNS lookups. The reason why is in a port scan context, if it can't look up the host name of the machine, in some cases, most of the time, actually, it'll error out. So we're going to specify -n to keep it from doing that. So it's not going to do any lookup from DNS. The other switch I'm going to specify is Z. Now, the Z means that it's going to not try to establish a connection. It's just going to test the port to see if it's responsive. Okay. So, and then I'll specify in this case 192.168.1.170. That's our Debian test box. And we'll specify ports 22, 80, 444, and 8080, just to see what's over there. And we'll go ahead and run that. And so you can see from the output here that it's actually informing us that SSH is open, HTTP is open, but port 444 is not open, as is port 8080. That's also not open. So in this case, you can actually see that we were able to successfully tell that those two ports that I told you about from that Debian box are in fact listening, and they're open. So you can go ahead and try to connect to them if you would like. So in a pen test pen test context, for example, this can be incredibly useful. as a port scanner that you can sort of just pick up and make use of, again, because Netcat is so commonly and frequently occurring. And if it's not, it's very easy to put it in place without needing to install a tremendous amount of files, et cetera, et cetera. So that's scenario number one. Scenario number two is actually a little bit more complicated. We're going to be creating a reverse shell. So we're going to export a shell from the Debian instance, and we're going to receive that on our Kali instance. So how do you go about doing that? Well, the first thing that you need is we need to have a listener on the Kali device, something for our Debian install to connect to. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to use nc. In this case, I'm going to specify verbose output. I'm going to specify -l for listen. I'm going to specify -n again because we don't want to have it look up DNS for this. We know what the machine is. We don't care what the DNS entry is. And then we want to have it listen on an arbitrary port. In this case, I'll pick port 8000. So once we establish this, it'll be in listen mode. So you can see it's listening on any interface for connections on port 8000. And then let's hop over to our Debian install here. I'll just clear the screen to make things a little bit more legible. And basically, what we're going to do is we're going to use Netcat. We're going to specify the address of our Kali instance, in this case 192.168.1.169. We're going to specify the port, and then we're also going to use the -e flag. Now -e, if you recall, means execute. So what's going to happen is it's going to establish that connection, and then it's going to execute a command. In this case, we want it to execute bin bash. So let's go ahead and do that and see what happens. Now you'll notice over here on our Kali box that it says connect from unknown, and then it's telling us that there has been some connection. And let's go ahead and see if we can cat etc password. See what that does. So here you go. So here's the contents of the password file. One thing that does tend to confuse people a little bit, which bears mentioning, is you'll notice that I don't have a prompt here. So you'll note if you look on the Debian box, you'll see we have a prompt, whereas on this Kali box we don't. The reason for that is that much like with Metasploit, when you're executing a vulnerability, for example, you're exploiting a vulnerability, it's not really, in this case, it's not designed to be an interactive shell. We're not interacting with it the same way that we would, you know, SSH when we log in, or when we sit down at the console. So it's expected that we wouldn't see any prompt here, which does take a little bit of getting used to. But if you do any pen testing, that's a thing that you will commonly encounter. So that's it. Two examples. One using Netcat as an impromptu port scanner. The other one using Netcat as a reverse shell, which again, you can certainly use Netcat to Netcat as we've done in this example, but keep in mind that this can be any socket, right? This can be, you can export, speaking of Metasploit, right? You can export export a shell to a Netcat listener instance after you've exploited a vulnerability, for example, using a tool like Metasploit or what have you. So that's all we're going to cover today. Thank you for spending this time with us, and hopefully you will find Netcat a valuable tool to add to your security arsenal. Thank you.